Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Sic Semper Tyrannis News. I'm your host, Mark Matheny. What's really happening in the conflict between the Ukraine and Russia? What's behind all of that? That's what I want to talk about tonight, because I've done a lot of research, thought long and hard about this. We're seeing a lot of things in the news. We're seeing the recent escalation in tensions between the United States and Russia, all having to do with Ukraine. And if we go back and think about it, during the Trump administration, things were relatively calm, not only in the Ukraine, but around the world, just in general. The cessation of conflict, or at least very low level. But now we're seeing this conflict in the Ukraine. And so think about it right now. You've got the Biden administration in office. And as soon as the Biden administration gets back into office, what I mean by that is Joe Biden being the vice president under the Obama administration, all of this ties in with basically the conflict that's taking place right now, or the potential conflict, and there is a conflict there between the Ukraine and the Russian Empire. But what's really happening behind the scenes, it's not really being talked about in the mainstream news. The mainstream news tries to portray Russia as this aggressor who wants to go in and just take over the Ukraine. But there's a little more to it than that. And part of that is that there is a region called the Donbass region in the Ukraine. And there's been a conflict between the Ukraine and the Donbass region since 2014, when groups known as the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, the DPR and the LPR, broke away from the Ukraine. They were pro-Russian. But most people don't know about this little-known war. And it's key to what's happening now. For one thing, when the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic broke away from the Ukraine in 2014, they created a federation called the Novorossiya. But that region's really more commonly known as the Donbass region. So we'll tonight refer to it as the Donbass region for clarification, just so you know what I'm talking about. And to show you, let me show you the Donbass region of the Donbass region. And if you see it on the map here, it's this section right here that I'm circling. This section is the Donbass region, right near Russia, connecting with Russia. So this is what we're talking about. That region right there, the Donbass region. But in the Donbass region, it's largely populated by Russian speakers. And they are strong, what they would call anti-Maidan movement. They're called an anti-Maidan movement. And they grew in that region after the 2014 coup in Kiev. And this movement's goal was to prevent far-right groups from entering the region.
Ukrainian army positions are close. Their soldiers are 350 meters across there, says this fighter.
Almost exactly a year ago, we were reporting from this village, but on the Ukrainian military-controlled side of the front line. Now, soldiers with the army of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic here, say that the situation has got a lot worse since then, and they say that the Ukrainian military are making attempts to try and push forward across the grey zone.
Both sides blame each other for starting the recent escalation in fighting. These men describe themselves as members of the People's Militia or the army of the Donetsk People's Republic. They say they are better trained than ever before, and they now receive a salary. Despite the evidence, Russia has always denied any military involvement in this conflict, even training men like these. The Ukrainians have tried to push forward a couple of times but have failed, this fighter says. But it's not like in 2014 when we were rebels. Now we are an army. The men here say they are defending their cultural and linguistic rights. We are Orthodox Russians and we are Russian speakers living in Donbass, this commander says. We don't recognize the Ukrainian government. We want here to speak our own language. I'm defending my family, my world, and my authenticity.
Now, think about it for a second while we're talking about this. This is around the same time under the Obama administration that they were moving into the Ukraine to set up an anti-corruption group, and they sent $1.8 billion into the bank there under a known mafia-type leader who was chainsawing people's heads off and things. And at the same time, you had Hunter Biden then becoming the head of the board of Burisma in that area. And if you go into all of the corruption there, basically the Obama administration and them sent $1.8 billion in, and that was to fund the Ukrainian People's Army against the, in my opinion, the Donbass region, so that they could retake that region. But the Obama administration didn't want to go through Congress to do so, so they were doing that through this front organization, this anti-corruption organization. But once the investigation of Burisma started and Hunter Biden and so on, that's when Joe Biden went in there and threatened them to remove the prosecutor or else they wouldn't get $1 billion and all of these things.
I remember going over convincing our team, or others too, convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over for, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I said, I'm not going to, or we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, what, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid.
So all that wraps in and ties in with it. There was pure corruption going on through the Biden administration. But at the same time, that's when this movement took place and they broke away. There was what they call a coup, where the Donbass region broke away from Ukraine. And Russia, at the same time, annexed the Crimea Peninsula of the Ukraine in March of 2014, following the ousting of a pro-Russian president in Kiev. But despite the fact that Russia was supporting the separatists, Kiev claims that many of the Russian soldiers traveled to that region in Donbass. But it's highly unlikely that the soldiers from Russia and the Allies traveled to the Ukraine against the will of the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. They wouldn't have done anything outside of his will, obviously. And so you have this intense fighting in the region that I've shown you on the map, and civilian casualties are still happening because Ukraine is trying to then take back the Donbass region. And at that time, Ukraine's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, borrowed $3 billion from Russia to resist protesters in the early days of the conflict. And then he was ousted. And the Ukraine failed to pay back that money, which led to Russia suing for repayment of that money in British courts. In the United Nations Human Rights Office, they reported that in February of 2015 and in June of 2016, you had 261 civilians who were killed on both sides of this conflict. And they stress, however, that these figures were conservative estimates, and the DPR's numbers of the reported casualties could be a lot higher than that. So there's been several truces in the meantime called between, the Ukrainian Republic, or the Republic of Ukraine, and the Donbass region in December of 2016, but overall the peace hasn't been secured, obviously. So we're seeing the results of that now, and there's been 2 Minsk agreements, and the second one was signed by Vladimir Putin and Francis Holland and Angela Merkel and the Ukraine president at that time, Petro Poroshenko. But it really wasn't sustainable because there's still war. And so let me show you a video. This will kind of sum up some of the synopsis of what's happening and what happened in 2014 in the Donbass region as they broke away from the Ukraine because they disagreed with the anti-Russian president.
Воспитатель. Голову опусти.
Я считаю, что наш русский мир, Донбасс и Россия должны воссоединиться.
It's May the 1st, and pro-Russian rebel Lenin is taking his men to secure the Donetsk prosecutor's office for the separatist cause.
А где они есть?
Осторожно! Отойти! Флаг сюда! Флаг! Флаг сюда! Флаг республики сюда!
As Lenin celebrated, Ukrainian officials and police were being rounded up and escorted out of the building.
Убирай нахуй камеру, убирай ее. Защитник наш пошел.
With this latest takeover, eastern Ukraine's second largest city, Donetsk, enters into the hands of the pro-Russian separatists. headquartered in the regional state administration building. The pro-Russian rebels were forming their own local government and calling themselves the Donetsk People's Republic. In 11 days' time, they've decided to hold a referendum on the independence of Donetsk.
Референдум состоится 11 мая. Вопрос на референдуме остается неизменным и звучит следующим образом. Поддерживаете ли вы акт о провозглашении государственной самостоятельности Донецкой Народной Республики? И варианты ответов «да» или «нет».
Здесь люди готовы за свободу умереть. Мы должны стать независимыми. Мы должны сами самостоятельно жить. У нас есть для этого все возможности, а главное, мы так хотим. Это мы и делаем, нет ничего другого. И не может быть. Смех, улыбка, и тогда все будет хорошо.
Even though the makeshift parliament consents to hold a referendum, there seems little doubt as to where the loyalties of the participants lay. The removal of the Ukrainian authorities from Donetsk left a power vacuum as well as a city to run. Various people and groups are now vying for positions and power within the would-be republic.
Там 15 вагонов прибудет митингующих еще, плюс к этому парку Щербакова. 16:23 на ЖД прибытие будет.
Repositioning himself in the new republic is Roma, a former builder and now the republic's head of security.
Декларация о суверенитете Народной Донецкой Республики. Печать даже очень символичная. Главный специалист отдела по вопросам борьбы с коррупцией. Да.
Короче, взяли мы сволочь один боевой, понял? Угу. Надо за него денежку отдать. А эти наши финансисты сказали только через тебя все решать.
А сколько? Ты ж мне хоть потом принеси, покажи его. Или он тут у тебя с собой?
In the run-up to the referendum, volunteers have been joining the cause, and people have taken to the streets to show their support for the People's Republic, as well as their hatred of Ukraine.
Добрый день. Мы рады вас приветствовать. Скажите мне, у кого нет родственников в России? А у кого есть родственники в Евросоюзе? Ну, то есть давайте мы просто сопоставим вот такие позиции. Когда вам говорят, что там, где ваши родственники, это враги и оккупанты, это называется оскорбительно для меня. А вот, знаете, так не получилось, что в Евросоюзе есть.
Радостно, что кто-то будет заботиться о нас.
Только Россия дает нам шанс выйти в светлое будущее. Но точно не Евросоюз.
Чтобы не было войны, чтобы молодые пацаны не гибли из-за всякой фигни.
And so, the Donbass region is considered a pro-Russian separatist. And there was a member of the Ukrainian parliament, his name was Maxim Buzansky. And he said that several European countries have territorial claims against the Ukraine. And in his opinion, revanchist sentiments come from Poland, Romania, and Hungary, but Buzansky emphasized that Kiev's weakness plays into the other three countries' hands and provides an opportunity to revise the history of the region. Now, Ukraine listen, beyond reasonable doubt, violates the EU's Treaty of Lisbon and other initiatives that protect minorities. Yet, even the Polish minority suffering in Ukraine, Warsaw, is unwilling to challenge Ukraine in a serious way that doesn't want to weaken the country, since it resolutely continues to challenge and provoke Russia. For this reason, Buzansky's fear that Poland, Hungary, and Romania are seeking territorially to expand at the expense of Ukraine may sound unfounded, but definitely serves as an excuse to escalate the persecution of minorities. Okay? So